Hello, everybody. Professor Barth is here. Inflation is patriotic. Have you heard yet? That's the new narrative, or that's where the narrative is headed. It is your patriotic duty to accept inflation and to not complain about it. Now, yesterday, the new CPI numbers came out, 7.9% increase in consumer prices over the last year. And the White House, and the Democratic Party in particular, has really struggled with the narrative on inflation for the last year. For the longest time, they said, it's transitory. And then when it was clear that it wasn't transitory, they tried to shift the blame. And they said, it's supply chain issues, or it's the COVID pandemic. We didn't see the Delta variant coming. And, the Delta variant came, but it will come and pass, and it will ease off by the beginning of 2022. But then January and February rolled around. The pandemic is over. Okay, so that excuse doesn't fly anymore, and yet inflation is at 40-year highs. Well, now, conveniently, the Russian-Ukraine conflict has permitted the White House to pivot by pinning the inflation on Vladimir Putin. And so now, the narrative more and more is becoming, you're going to see this grow, is my prediction. The narrative is now saying it is your patriotic duty to accept higher prices. That is the cost of defending democracy, defending the American way, and defeating Vladimir Putin. And if you moan about it, we'll see. These are all quotes, by the way. I'll show you a few of them in a minute. If you moan about it, if you complain about it, then you're complicit in the inflation. Now, throughout all this, there's been tiny kernels of truth. Okay, yeah, there were supply chain issues. Yeah, there were issues with the pandemic and consumer demand coming out of the pandemic. Yeah, it's true, the Russia oil and Ukrainian wheat, that has an impact. But it's a kernel of truth while deliberately obfuscating, while deliberately ignoring the primary culprit, okay? Never mind the fact that the Federal Reserve has more than doubled its balance sheet and the money supply has grown by more than 40%, while the federal government has spent money like a drunken sailor in a brothel. Never mind that, okay? It's the Russians, okay? It's the Russians now. The Democrats really are out of moves. They've got to blame the Russians and Putin because the inflation, not only is the inflation not going away, but it's getting worse. The thing is, it was going to get worse, and it was getting worse regardless of what happened with Russia and Ukraine. But now Russia and Ukraine has given the Democrats in the White House this convenient excuse, and they need that for the midterms. So this is going to be the driving narrative over the next few months as inflation gets worse. This is the argument you're going to see. Now, President Biden released a statement yesterday on the Consumer Price Index. He said this: today's inflation report is a reminder that Americans' budgets are being stretched by price increases and families are starting to feel the impacts of Putin's price hike. Putin's price hike, okay? So now the inflation is Putin's price hike. A large contributor to inflation this month was an increase in gas and energy prices as markets reacted to Putin's aggressive actions. But wait, Putin's invasion didn't occur until later in the month of February. In the month of January and December and November, prices were going up too. But no, it's a Putin price hike. As I've said from the start, there will be costs at home as we impose crippling sanctions in response to Putin's unprovoked war. But Americans can know this: the costs we are imposing on Putin and his cronies are far more devastating than the costs we are facing. And then he separately said this in his press conference, in which he announced the ban on Russian oil imports into the United States. Putin's war against the people of Ukraine is causing prices to rise. So the narrative is being set now. And again, a kernel of truth. I mean, nobody can deny it. It's had a detrimental impact on the price of gasoline at the pump, and then that has a downstream effect. Okay, that can be true while also recognizing that the primary culprit of the inflation was still in place and was still headed in this direction. And inflation was still headed toward what seems quite inevitable to me now, double-digit CPI around the corner. Since Putin began his military buildup on Ukrainian borders, Biden said, just since then, the price of gas at the pump went up 75 cents. And with this action, banning imports of Russian oil, it's going to go up further. I'm going to do everything I can to minimize Putin's price hike here at home. Then Treasury Secretary, former Federal Reserve Chair, Janet Yellen predicts very uncomfortably high inflation. Those are strong words. Not uncomfortably high. Very uncomfortably high. Very uncomfortably high. By the way, the CPI during the Carter early Reagan inflation crisis of the late 70s, early 80s, the CPI peaked at 13.5%. 13.5%. I fear that ceiling is going to be broken. I desperately hope that I'm wrong, because that's going to hurt everyone. It's going to hurt yours truly a lot if that were to happen. But we are headed in that direction. I mean, 13.5%. We're at 7.9, and now, even with that 7.9 figure, the Treasury Secretary is warning of, quote, very uncomfortably high inflation. This is what she said in an interview with CNBC. My guess is that next month we'll see further evidence of an impact on U.S. inflation of Putin's war on Ukraine. We have certainly seen meaningful increases in oil prices that are related to Russia's invasion and the expectation that it would invade Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia are major producers of wheat. We are seeing impacts on food prices. So now food prices can be blamed on the Russian-Ukrainian war. There will be further supply chain issues in the short run, and it will add to U.S. inflation as well as European inflation. But it's very critical, she continued, and I think Americans feel strongly, as people all over the world do, that this kind of behavior, Putin's behavior, violates every international norm. What we're really seeing is an atrocity, and peace-loving democratic nations need to and are standing up against it. We've designed these sanctions to have the maximum impact on Russia while mitigating fallout for everyone else, including the United States, but it's not realistic to think we can take actions of this magnitude without feeling some consequences ourselves. So, look, this goes with the program. Peace-loving democratic nations need to accept we're going to have inflation in order to defend our values, and that's a cost worth bearing. So now I'm telling you, the pivot. Inflation is something. It's our someone said when you put your when you're pumping gas into a pump, think you're sticking it to Vladimir Putin. Well, when you're paying those extra high prices at the grocery store, you're sticking it to Vladimir Putin. You're defending American democracy. We're likely to see, she said, another year in which 12-month inflation numbers remain very uncomfortably high. And then you see it all over. Salon from 2 days ago. Surging prices and wheat shortages, how the invasion of Ukraine is impacting global food supplies. Again, kernel of truth. But it's obfuscating the real culprit here of what's happening. This was happening regardless, okay? This was happening. This might exacerbate it, okay? It will exacerbate it a bit. But it was happening, and it's a systemic problem. It's a systemic issue. It's not purely exogenous, okay? But they're going to try to make it exogenous. Oh, we couldn't help it. Inflation was going to go away, and Russia, Ukraine. This is from USA Today. Opinion columnist, yes, gas prices are soaring, but it's a necessary sacrifice for Americans to stop tyranny. Americans need to be aware of the cost of defending freedom. This is an editorial from the Chicago Tribune. The price to protect freedom paid at your local gas station. That's from yesterday. In this editorial, it talks about the pains of inflation. It concedes, yes, inflation is painful, but most heartening is a brave example of the ordinary people of Ukraine. For generations, Ukrainians were denied the freedom that Americans have long enjoyed. Given their current life and death struggle against aggression, it is small-minded to moan about the price of gasoline at the local pump or groceries at the supermarket. If you moan, if you complain about the higher prices at the pump or at the supermarket, You are small-minded, and you lack the perspective of this life and death struggle. It's unpatriotic, okay? It's another way of saying unpatriotic. Let's hope our country can follow the Ukrainian example and pull together to protect democracy, even at $4 plus a gallon. Or Stephen Colbert will take it just a step further. He said, very infamously earlier this week, today the average gas price in America hit an all-time record high of over $4 per gallon. Okay, that stings. But a clean conscience is worth a buck or two. I'm willing to pay $4 a gallon. Hell, I'll pay $15 a gallon because I drive a Tesla. Man, that was just a perfect window into the attitude of the American ruling class, the American elite. They'll be fine. They'll be fine through this. But you make under 100K a year, or even make a little more than that, you're gonna suffer, and your standard of living is gonna go down. But you know what? That's the price for defending democracy. That's the price for defending democracy, and it will give you a clean conscience too. Give you a clean conscience too as your grocery bill goes up. Biden urges from the New York Times. This editorial here explains this is not a foolproof strategy of the Democrats. It's risky. This is risky. It's the direction they're going. Okay, there's no doubt about that. They're going to go this direction as inflation worsens. They're going to point to Russia, but it's a risky strategy, as the New York Times explains. Biden urges Americans to blame rising prices on Putin. Many do for now. With the midterm elections 8 months away, so if the midterm elections were next month, the Democrats might be a little okay here. They maybe get a little bump from the war. Okay, but the midterm elections are 8 months away. Okay, so the urgent political question for Mr. Biden is whether the American people are prepared to go along with blaming the Russians and not him for rising costs. So that's the gamble. Now, the Democrats don't have a choice. They got to do this. But that's the gamble. Will the American people go along with this? Will they blame the Russians and not him? It's certainly a challenge, but it's not one that we really have a choice about making, said a Democratic strategist about imposing financial penalties on Russia. There's broad support for standing up to Putin and putting these sanctions in place, including those that will increase the cost of gas. So right now, the pivot's being made, inflation being pinned on Putin. And that will work for now. We'll see how long can that continue as inflation continues to rise. And what happens if inflation begins moving into double digits? What if we reach that 13.5% that you saw in 1980? Or what if it even moves beyond that to 15%, 20%? Pray that doesn't happen. But it is certainly not impossible or even unlikely per se if the Federal Reserve acts stupidly and doesn't aggressively initiate quantitative tightening. And if it does initiate quantitative tightening aggressively, that's going to cause a recession. So again, the Fed's in a rock and a hard place. But let's say inflation really persists, and eventually, my prediction, you'll see another pivot, a pivot away from blaming Putin for the inflation toward blaming Americans or certain Americans. You'll see a shift in blame to industries and merchants for so-called price gouging. And you've already seen a little bit of that with, it's the meat companies and it's the grocers that are price gouging. They'll blame so-called speculators for driving up prices. That's always a favorite target. Richard Nixon did that in the early 70s. Blame speculators. You can always do that. But then you could broaden it out. And if it got bad, if inflation really started to get bad, the blame would broaden. Okay? If you complain about the inflation, if you complain, if you dissent from the orthodox line regarding the cause of inflation, if you say no, the inflation was caused by exorbitant money printing at the Federal Reserve and by the drunken spending habits of the federal government enabled by the Federal Reserve, if you buy gold, if you buy silver, if you buy Bitcoin, Ethereum, if you get out of dollars by purchasing hard assets, you're complicit in the inflation. You're undermining confidence and faith in the U.S. dollar. That's a pivot that you could foresee coming if things start to get bad. So I'm putting a warning shot out there. And one of the reasons I know that, because this has happened historically, when inflation starts to spiral, you get a lot of accusations thrown everywhere for the causes of inflation. It's usually speculators and people who are undermining confidence in the currency. They get the blame. Happened during the French Revolution when the French currency, the assignat, began to hyperinflate. The revolutionaries blamed speculators, shopkeepers, and anybody who questioned the solidity of that French fiat paper currency. It actually even happened during the American Revolution. We fought the Revolutionary War with fiat paper currency, and it hyperinflated. I support that war, and actually, I think the currency was needed for that war. But you had interests there who were complaining about it or raising prices, and they were targeted as enemies. Okay, and you can see in our hyper partisan atmosphere, our culture of perpetual moral panic that we've seen over the last couple of years. Okay, what do I mean by that? Just in the last 2 years alone, we've seen moral panic over the coronavirus. Okay, coronavirus. If you're not stricken with coronaphobia, if you don't want to wear a mask everywhere, if you don't want to get vaccinated, what are you? You're anti-science. You are. You want to kill Granny, okay? You're selfish, all right? Or the BLM, okay? You're not on board with BLM? You don't agree with Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi and the 1619 Project? You're a white supremacist, okay? The moral panic. January 6th, okay? You think a lot of it, the response to it was a bit overhyped, to quote the New York Times columnist, or you think that those who were arrested for it deserve due process of law. You're an insurrectionist. Or the latest example, this conflict in Ukraine. You're not on board with the whole dominant media narrative. You're a Putin lover. Maybe you're even an agent of the Kremlin. And now with the dollar, if inflation really starts to take off, and we're not there yet, but you think in this atmosphere of perpetual moral panic and just a real black-white view of the universe and the world, okay, where you're either good or evil. Do you think if inflation started to get out of control, and when inflation gets out of control, that can cause societal breakdown? Okay, it's happened many, many times throughout history. We're not immune to that. You don't think in our culture, our hyper-partisan culture, that there won't be a moral panic about inflation, and that blame would not be directed toward those who don't agree with the official line about inflation? You don't think that could happen? You complain about inflation, you're giving aid and comfort to Vladimir Putin. You're undermining confidence in our currency. With all the suspicion, accusations, paranoia, slander, it's happened before, and it can happen here. I'm just warning, okay? I'm putting it out there, March of 2022. That needs to be said, and we hope and pray it never gets to that point. It would take pretty high inflation for it to get there, but you start getting into 15-20%, if God help us, if it starts to get there or beyond that, we're in trouble, because that rhetoric would pick up and it would gain traction. I'm just putting a warning shot out there. I'll close with this. Janet Yellen sort of accidentally said some truths just the other day. She said, inflation is first and foremost the job of the Federal Reserve. She's right about that. That is their job, first and foremost. Of course, she didn't mean it like that. What she meant was we have to look at the Federal Reserve to take steps to bring down inflation. I have confidence the Fed will take the actions that are needed. I hope they do. I hope the Fed needs to step up, but the problem is the Fed caused it, okay? And in the steps that are needed to stop this inflation, it would be economically quite painful. So we'll have to see, okay? That's it. I just thought I'd throw in another video about the inflation. I'll see you next time.